And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Using Stages of Accomplishment Workbooks in Treatment by Dr. Phil Rich. And before turning this over to Phil, I just want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about Neare Press and also a few housekeeping chores as well. For those of you who don't know Neare Press, our mission is to share the cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. And unlike many other publishers, Neare Press is really a group of us professionals who will work with you in the field. So we really welcome your feedback, and we can accomplish our goals much better if we have your suggestions, your input, and feedback. So I think before we get started, though, I'd like to also take a quick poll and just to see how many of you have attended a Neare Press webinar before. And wondering, Tim, if you could launch the poll for me, that'd be great. And while you're taking the poll, just to say, for those of you who just can answer yes or no, that would be great. And if you're taking the poll, just want to also consider becoming a sponsor of our webinar series. And to become a sponsor, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you get actually access to the whole slate of our exciting new 2016-17 webinar series, which are now posted on our website. And as a sponsor, you're guaranteed a seat at every webinar. You can get free CE credits as well, and 2 Neare Press books. The cost for that is $98 for an individual, and also $250 for an organization. And Tim, have you been able to launch that? And do you have any results you can tell us about? So Tim, you can jump in anytime.
Sorry. Yes, we have about 76% voted, 66% have been, 34% have not.
Okay, great. So we have a group of people who have been here before. That's wonderful. Welcome back to those, and welcome to our new people who are here for the first time. So just as most other workshops, you have to do learning objectives. So our learning objectives for today are that participants, that you will understand the values and limitations of workbooks in treatment with adolescents. I also develop an understanding of how best to use the workbooks in treatment, and last, learn a series of pointers that might be useful in the implementation of these workbooks. Second, I just want to say that the PowerPoint is posted on the Neare Press website if you want to take a look at the PowerPoint as you follow along with Phil. We also will be, as Tim mentioned earlier, we'll be posting a recording of the webinar later this week, and we'll also be sending you a certificate of attendance. When the workshop is over, please be sure to close out your account and answer the short survey at the end. We really appreciate your feedback. And finally, we are partnering with GIFR, the Global Institute for Forensic Research, to offer you free CE credits for those of you who are attending. So the 147 of you who are on the call right now, and for the few who will still be joining, to say if you've signed up for CE credits, we'll be sending you a form to complete. And if you could send that to GIFR at within the next 7 days, they'll be sending you your certificate for CE credits. Also, just want to take a moment to mention the 4 workbooks that we'll be discussing today, the Stages of Accomplishment workbooks. The Stages of Accomplishment is a series of 4 interrelated workbooks that assist in the treatment of sexually abusive and sexually troubled adolescents, and building from simpler ideas to more complex and richer subjects and concepts. The workbooks take take the youth through a series of guided exercises, and will cover many of the more significant elements of treatment. The workbooks are available for $49 for the full set, and we're also offering this 20% discount if you use the discount code September 27, and the Neare bookstore, either by phone or if you do it online, we can give you a 20% discount. This offer expires on October 17th. Phil also will be offering a an in-person training, additional training in Albany, New York, and it's a 3-day certification on the assessment of juvenile sexual risk, and it's from October 17th through the 19th. 3 days of CE credits are available, and the course will cover the process of risk assessment from theory, method, and instrumentation to case study and applied practice. There is 1 space available, so if you're interested, give us a call, send us an email very quickly. And last and most importantly, I just want to take a moment to introduce our speaker. Dr. Phil Rich presents, trains, and consults nationally and internationally, and is currently in private practice as a consultant and trainer specializing in work with sexually abusive youth. Phil has worked extensively with sexually troubled youth and the staff working with his client group and has written 4 books, 9 if you include this series of Stages of Accomplishment workbooks, and numerous articles and chapters addressing the assessment and treatment of sexual abuse of youth. So I really want to take a moment here to introduce both a wonderful friend, an incredible colleague, and also just a great human being. So Phil, I'll turn this over to you now.
Okay. So my camera should now be on, and give me 1 second to get my screen. The screen's got to get turned over to me so I can.
Yeah.
Okay. So show my screen. So you should now be seeing my screen. Yes?
Not yet. Yes, we do.
Okay.
You're all set.
Okay. So hi,
Thanks,
everybody. Thanks, Joan, for the intro. Okay. I do have a lot of material, as I always do. But one of the things about webinars is that you can cover a lot of material. All of the material is going to be available to you, as Joan and Tim said. It's available online. The webinar will be recorded, and you'll be able to go back and if you want to get more detail, because we're going to move through it fairly quickly. And we'll leave room at the end for questions. So let me get started without any ado. The first part of this is really just generally using workbooks in treatment. You can see there a little image of the 4 workbooks. There's also a clinician's workbook that you'll see on the screen. So the first part, I'm really just going to quickly move through just generally thinking about using workbooks in treatment, their strengths and their limitations. I think the first thing to say is really that our kids are whole people, right? They're not simply sexual offenders or sexually abusive youth or whatever terminology we use. The workbooks that we have in our field, there's not too many of them. Stages, of course, is one set. There are others available. Stages is the one we're going to be mostly talking about today. But again, generally, we're going to talk about workbooks for the first few slides. These workbooks really address more than just sexually troubled behavior. They try to address lots of the issues that the kids that we work with face. These are kids who face lots of problems in many cases beyond just sexually troubled behavior. And most of these workbooks, especially as they've evolved over the last 10, 15 years, recognize that our clients are in fact whole people. And that in order to really understand sexually abusive, sexually troubled, sexually inappropriate behavior, we've got to really understand it in this much larger context. That is, the context of our clients being entire people, not simply kids with sexual behavior problem. At the same time, we want to understand that when we think about the use of workbooks, we've got to understand that workbooks build upon the idea that they just represent not the whole of treatment. That's one of the things that's changed over the last, say, 15 to 20 years of using workbooks. The workbook is just part of treatment. When we use workbooks on their own, they really cannot meet the need for whole treatment, for whole people. They can only really address a few subjects. In lots of ways, workbooks are static things, right? They're things that exist on paper. Workbook's approach is primarily psychoeducational. That is, we're trying to provide information, we're trying to provide ideas, we're trying to teach kids concepts, tools, things that they can do, strategies and skills that we think are important in their treatment in general. Because, of course, workbooks are aimed at a whole population, not that individual kid that we're working with. We need to find ways to customize workbooks for individuals. I'll come back to that. So workbooks provide this psychoeducational approach. And in the end, though, it's really about rehabilitation. But beyond teaching through psychoeducation, workbooks also provide a way for kids to learn more about themselves. It can be a self-guided experience. Workbooks are designed, and that's true certainly for the Stages workbooks, to be used in treatment programs, but also to be used by clients on their own. So they provide a way for self-guided learning. They provide a way for self-discovery. That is the point, not simply to provide information and ideas. And it provides a way to integrate ideas and integrate experience, so these things come together. Workbooks also, in general, allow us to go beyond the therapeutic hour, if you will. They allow us to go outside of the therapist's office. They allow us to both add a workbook as an addendum to treatment and an extension of treatment. And so that makes the workbook more important because it allows the treatment to go beyond that simple hour of therapy a week. When we think of workbooks as an adjunct or an addendum to treatment, we understand that workbooks provide a foundation for treatment. They extend that interactive face-to-face therapy session beyond that particular 1 hour, in which workbook ideas in that hour can be brought to life. We don't want kids to just work on these things on their own. and we want them to bring them into treatment. And in treatment, we want to really bring those workbook ideas into life. We want to explore those ideas with them. We want to develop those ideas in a way that psychoeducation on its own, simply teaching, can never really hope to accomplish. Basic ideas are taught through typically written exercises that are in the workbooks, not in every case, but typically through written exercises. And when kids have completed a workbook, kids can show themselves, they can show their families, they can show treatment staff, they can show their probation officers that are on probation, they can show folks who are in their life what they're learning about treatment and that they're involved in treatment in terms of important ideas that we want them to understand. If we make sure that we assimilate this material, not simply into a written exercise that a client completes in some bedroom or some kitchen somewhere or in their room if they're in a residential program, but we want to make sure that they're assimilating these ideas into their daily lives and that they will be able to show people not simply through the completion of a written exercise, but through their changes that they're making in their everyday lives, that they're really applying these ideas. We're really and I'll come back to these ideas. We want to make sure that kids aren't simply learning these ideas in a rote fashion, but they're in fact applying these ideas, applying these skills in their everyday lives. And that's really important, right? Application of these ideas, not simply writing it down, no matter how well written it is. We want to see application in behaviors, relationships, social skills, beliefs, attitudes, etc., etc. But this is important. The workbook is not the treatment. That idea of the map not being the territory. So we've got to ensure that as kids complete workbooks, we understand that's not the whole treatment. We've got to balance the use of a workbook against larger treatment gains. Over the years, many times I've heard kids say that doing their treatment is completing the workbook. And that idea that when the workbook is finished, somehow they're done with treatment. That's that idea of balancing the completion of the workbook, no matter how well done it is, against the application of those ideas, those treatment gains in their real life that we can see. We don't want to dampen their enthusiasm. We don't want to minimize their accomplishments, but we want to bear in mind that using the workbook, completing the workbook on its own does not mean that they've completed treatment or that they've been successful in treatment. Although, of course, being able to use a workbook, no matter what the workbook, thoroughly and well, is certainly an important element in treatment. So think of the workbook as a guided set of ideas, a guided set of exercises. Different workbooks will have different ideas and different exercises, although they all overlap to some great degree. These ideas, these exercises, these assignments, this psychoeducation helps to really standardize treatment in many ways for all our clients, and also structure treatment, but they need to be used within a larger treatment program if we're using it as part of the treatment program. And that larger program really needs to guide the treatment rather than have the workbook define the treatment itself. When we use workbooks as they're intended to be used, and this is certainly true of the Stages workbook, the workbook becomes just a part of treatment, not the whole of treatment. So that idea of don't mistake the map for the territory, and help our clients and their probation officers or their family members, other folks who are involved in the treatment, to also understand it's an element of treatment. This idea is important because even though these ideas that we're teaching, these written exercises, have a lot of value, we hope, that's the whole point, they help to, as I said earlier, build self-reflection skills, build self-knowledge, provide information, importantly, give kids a language that they can learn to help recognize their own problem areas, how to avoid those problem areas, how to work their way through them, things like seemingly unimportant decisions or high-risk factors or dangerous situations, and can help them to avoid problematic thinking, to recognize problematic behavioral cycles before they begin or before they progress too far, or, as it says here, avoiding problems completely. So they're important, but we've got this idea of parroting, right? The ever-present risk that kids are going to learn to mimic what they're being taught. They're going to be able to repeat what's being said in the workbook, and sometimes even not simply fooling us into thinking that they really understand these concepts, but even themselves thinking they really understood those ideas. Kids, for instance, and the same, of course, is true for adults, can learn everything you want to know about thinking errors, for instance, but it doesn't really mean that they understand these ideas in their own life, that they can really apply this information in their own life. So we want to constantly be aware of parroting. We've got to be aware that kids and adults, for that matter, have got to go beyond simply in a rote fashion reciting back what they're learning. We've got to make sure they understand the material. Beyond that, we also want to understand that we've got to fit the workbook to the treatment program rather than building a treatment program around a workbook, which is something that we can do. We can help structure programs, but beyond that, we want to make sure the workbook fits the treatment program, because not everything in the workbook is going to is going to provide the kind of information perhaps that fits your program ideas. So we want to make sure that workbook material, when it doesn't fit the ideas of different individual clinicians or treatment programs, or differs from the ideas, can be shaped and used in a way that ensures that the workbook fits the program. We want to make sure there's an integrated fit between the workbooks. Let's use behavioral cycles as an example. Different programs perhaps don't use behavioral cycles, or if they do, they may not use the behavioral cycle that's included in the workbook. So we want to make sure there's an integration and not a split between the materials in the workbook and that larger treatment model. Again, the workbook is embedded into that larger treatment model. So we want to make sure that the workbook is not that well-known quote, it's not the tail that wags the dog. So individual clinicians, treatment programs that use workbooks have got to figure out, there's no quick and easy way of doing that. The clinician's guide that I've mentioned before certainly helps with that process. But figuring out how do you adapt your treatment models to fit workbook ideas, workbook approaches, or the other way around, how to make sure that you're using workbooks so they fit in with the approach and the ideas of the treatment program. Don't let the workbook be the tail that wags the program. In addition, as I said before, workbooks are static. They are really aimed at, even though they can be individualized, they really are aimed at the entire population. But of course, it's a heterogeneous population. The kids that we work with are all different. They're not the same. They're different by age, cognitive development, their intelligence level, emotional maturity, their social standing, their social skills development, their learning styles, you name it. Youth vary widely. And so we, as individual clinicians, have got to take into account these differences or these potential differences among clients, ensuring that when we assign and discuss workbook material, we're aiming it at the cognitive, the developmental, the skill, and the psychological level of each individual client. So even though we're talking about a necessarily standardized, static workbook, in our use, and we'll come back and talk about that at least briefly. We don't have, again, an awful lot of time. We'll talk at least briefly about how to do that. We want to make sure that we work at the level of the client. In turn, that's going to increase the chances that the workbooks are going to be responsive to the individual client, and that increases the chances that kids are going to understand the material, be able to internalize that material, and experience success. But also, of course, it's a facet when we talk about individualizing treatment. This is exactly what we're talking about. We want to make sure that we fit the treatment to the individual. Some of you will be familiar with the R&R model, risk, need, and responsivity, 3 principles that ideally shape treatment. That's exactly what we're talking about here, making sure that treatment is responsive to the needs, the capacities, the skills, the social standing, etc., of each client. Here are those pointers that Joe talked about very briefly when we talked about some of the goals. These are general pointers for the use of any workbook, and if anybody's interested in more detail, because there's not a lot of detail here, even in these slides, just email me. I'll have my email up at on the very last slide. There's more detail, but generally we'll go through these quickly. When you think about not simply the workbook that you've purchased to use, but the exercises or the chapters within each workbook, be selective, be judicious, make sure that you're making sure that the workbook exercises fit that particular individual client at his or her level, and in terms of their level in treatment at that time, if you will. Make sure that the workbook, even though it is a static thing, right, it's something that exists on paper, help to bring these ideas to life, help to bring these materials to life. That's why it's important to make sure that we bring workbooks into treatment sessions and not simply assign them outside of sessions. And on that very note, some workbook assignments should be completed in the therapy session. It's up to you to pick and choose which ones. But if you simply use sessions to complete workbook assignments, you're never going to get anything else done in treatment. On the other hand, if you only assign different workbook exercises to be used outside of the therapeutic hour, you're never going to really have a good handle on how your clients are using them. So think about using some of those workbook assignments and complete it with the client in the therapy sessions. Customized treatment, again, age, IQ, cultural differences, gender differences, differences in the level of treatment that somebody's been involved with up until that point. Make sure that treatment is going to match the client. And go beyond the workbooks. They are static, but expand upon the workbooks. You can create some of your own workbook exercises or worksheet exercises. Talk about the workbooks. Talk about the assignments. Go beyond the pages of the workbook so it's not simply, again, a static entity. And staying with that very idea, the workbook is boundary, right? It has a beginning, it has an end. In the case of the stages workbooks, there's 4 of them, but they come to an end. Go beyond the boundaries of the workbooks. Bring in additional material that seems relevant. Integrate, blend material. Perhaps you're going to use more than one type of workbook. Or perhaps you're going to use material you found on the internet. Perhaps you're going to use material that your client has brought into treatment. Integrate material, blend it together so you're not just depending on the static workbook. And again, to make sure we're not simply parroting, go back in time. Sometimes a workbook exercise that made really good sense at that point makes good sense again 3 weeks later or 3 months later. Perhaps the first time round our clients demonstrated rudimentary understanding of it, but 3 months later, let's go back, repeat the exercises, repeat that chapter, revisit it, keep the workbooks alive, and of course, pace workbook use. This is the same for treatment in general. Not everything happens at the same time, of course. Some things have to happen first in order for other things to happen later. Some things that are happening now depend upon things happening at a prior time. So ensure that you're pacing treatment in general, and in this case, make sure that you're pacing workbook use so that it matches the needs, the abilities, and the particular situation that any particular client is in at any particular moment. Make sure that you are reviewing the workbook exercises, reviewing what they've learned, discuss it, test for retention, make sure that they've acquired and have retained the information, and importantly, test for comprehension. Do they understand it? And sometimes that means, on point number 8, repeating and revisiting at a later point to ensure that somebody does understand, does demonstrate comprehension. They may not be able to really fully understand something 3 months into treatment, but perhaps 6 months into treatment, they're better able to understand that workbook exercise. So test for retention, test for comprehension, and of course, show interest. Don't simply assign workbook exercises and never look at them or read through them and not talk about them. Show interest in the work that your clients are producing. Show interest in what they said in completing those written exercises. Show interest in your clients. And again, I'll go back to the idea that I'm giving you these kind of bullet points here, 1, 2, 3 through 13. There's more detail in each one of these. And by the way, these sorts of ideas are in the Clinician's Guide to the Stages series. But if you'd like more info and you don't have the Clinician's Guide, which of course we hope you'll get, just email me. I'm happy to send you more information. Don't depend on workbooks to be complete. They can't possibly contain all the information or all the ideas that are relevant to every individual client you have. Again, every one of your clients is different. So don't depend on workbook as the source of all of your treatment. Don't depend on the completion of workbooks as somehow a measure of treatment completion or treatment success. It simply means that they've acquired information, they're able to write it out. It's only through testing for retention, it's only through pacing treatment that we're going to really be able to use workbooks as part of treatment and not the entire treatment. And finally, make sure that we're integrating the workbook material, the workbook assignments into a much larger, more comprehensive model of treatment, which means that you've got to be nimble. You've got to be able to use workbooks. We'll get into talking about the stages books in particular in a few minutes, but make sure that you don't simply use the workbooks in a rote fashion, going from page 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Sometimes instead of going through A to Z, you may want to go from A to F and then back to B and then over to H and then perhaps up to R. Integrate these ideas into a more comprehensive model of treatment that fits the client. Make sure that the workbook exercises fit that larger model of treatment. Okay, let me shift gears here. Again, we don't have a lot of time, and there's a lot of info here. So let's take a quick tour through the stages of accomplishment workbook. Let's start with the idea of why it's called the stages of accomplishment. So I've said already several times, completing the workbook doesn't mean treatment has been completed. But what it does mean is that kids have accomplished something. Our clients have, in fact, if they've completed the workbooks, they've achieved information, they've achieved some level of success, they've accomplished something in being able to work their way through the workbooks, and we certainly want to acknowledge that, even though it does not necessarily mean they've completed treatment or they've necessarily integrated all of the ideas. It certainly reflects a level of accomplishment that we want to acknowledge and reward. I've said this already, but workbooks, of course, fit the need for standardized ideas, tools, concepts that we can really teach to all of our clients, and that in many ways those represent the core elements of sex offense specific treatment. That's a terminology that's getting more and more difficult to use, sex offense treatment. It's kind of shifted as we've shifted our sensibility on the way that we think about the clients that we work with, juvenile and adult, and the terminology we use. But for now, that's the terminology we're sort of still using: sex offense or sexual abuse specific treatment. Workbooks are designed to help really build that core, that standard central model. And it can be used, even though certainly not recommending that it be the treatment model. It certainly can provide the center, the core for a structured model of treatment. Standardized elements, standardized sequence if you use it in a stepwise fashion, although again, we recommend that you move back and forth as needed on an individualized basis, and it can provide a standardized core for a program of treatment, regardless of what workbook you use. At the same time, workbooks that can standardize treatment, we've got to make sure that we also are individualizing treatment, making sure that we're using the workbooks in a way that's customized for each of our individual clients based on their individual needs, et cetera, et cetera. Workbooks can certainly help to ensure that clinicians, although they're individualizing treatment, nevertheless are still focused on these sexually abusive, sexually troubled aspects of client behavior. Again, workbooks in general, and certainly it's true for the stages workbooks, go beyond just the sexually troubled behavior, but nevertheless, we want to make sure that they are focusing on the sexually troubled behavior that bring kids into treatment in the first place. We want to make sure that our clinicians using workbooks are talking about these common ideas, these common concepts, these common tools that are specific to the behavior we're treating, teaching that common language, not just to clients, but also to the families of clients, if the families are included in treatment, which is a really, really good idea and important to do. And that's also true for other providers who may be working with our clients, probation officers, other therapists outside of the program, for instance. Standardizing content, standardizing design, nevertheless, we can adapt workbooks to meet individualized treatment goals, making sure, again, that we fit the workbooks to meet the needs of kids at different points in their treatment, which again sometimes means going back and forth, going back to an earlier chapter, or in the case of the stages workbooks, where there's 4 workbooks, even going back to an earlier workbook. Sometimes it might mean jumping ahead in time. One way or another, how the workbooks are designed really is going to depend on several different things. Your choice as the clinician of what exercises are you going to use, what reading are you going to assign to individual clients, and thinking about why. Why does it fit the client at that particular time? How do you actually sequence the workbook use? In the case of the stages workbooks, do you go from page 1 on workbook 1 all the way through to the last page of workbook 4 in that particular sequence, or do you sequence it in a different way? And how do you add to the material that's in the workbook? How do you go beyond that material? These are things that individual clinicians are going to have to decide based upon their clients and their particular application of the model. The principle is that these workbooks add to a model of treatment, but that model of treatment is more than simply the information contained in the workbooks. We've got to individualize treatment for every individual client. I work with clients who aren't ready for workbooks. I can certainly assign them, but it doesn't mean they're going to do the workbook exercises. And if they do the workbook exercises, it doesn't mean they're going to really understand the exercise or are going to really work on it in a way that we want them to. Let's talk a little bit about applying it in the environment. The treatment environment, and I'll again briefly go through the structure of the workbooks in a few minutes. We've got a lot of written exercises. There's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of written exercises. There's a lot of thinking points that I'll come back and talk about a little bit. The thinking points are points in the written material that we want to stop at and encourage our clients to think about. what's going on? What have you learned so far? Where are we at? Here are some highlights. If this was a book, there might be those little sidebars that can really bring out some of the material. So the thinking points are important, but through those exercises, through those thinking points, the idea of the workbook is to provide that means for self-reflection, self-discovery, and how do you learn, and importantly, how do you practice these new skills? How do you bring them into the awareness of clients? Each exercise, each thinking point varies in content, varies in approach. The workbooks have different exercises at different points that look very different from one another, and they are intended for different purposes in the therapeutic process. Again, the idea that the process is paced and it moves along. Treatment is unlike the workbook, which is static, treatment is dynamic and it shifts and it moves. So part of the art and part of the skill of therapy is knowing when do you help different clients tackle the issues they're facing? What's the proximal moment at which you're ready to tackle a particular issue? Part of the art of knowing how to use the workbook, part of the skill of therapy is knowing when and how to tackle those issues with clients. So in using the Stages workbooks, you've got to be familiar with the workbooks. You have to read them. You have to know them. Again, when you buy the package, it comes with the clinician's guide, which is intended to help you understand the material, but there's really no substitute for really making sure that you yourself have read through the workbooks carefully so that you are familiar with those workbooks, how they're structured, what each workbook in the series contains, what's the approach of the workbooks, and what do those written exercises look like? What do those thinking points look like? When they're likely to be useful for any individual client? When is the client ready to not simply tackle the work, but as it says here, meaningfully tackle the work? When do you repeat an assignment or an exercise? Is it a month later, or is it the same day? Or when is it productive to complete or not complete certain material? Sometimes pushing a client to complete a chapter or an exercise may simply not be productive, and it may even be counterproductive. We don't want to be forcing, if you will, treatment onto kids. We want treatment in general to be collaborative and a partnership. We want to ensure that the workbooks are experienced by our clients as actually useful to them and not simply homework that they hate doing. The workbooks, the 4 of them in this case, are intended to be integrated whole, but to really be clear, they are not a treatment manual. We actually don't have any treatment manuals for work with kids with sexual behavior problems. Manualized treatment is very different. The workbooks are not intended to be a manual. They shouldn't be thought of that way, and they shouldn't be used that way, and that is true for all workbooks. They are workbooks. They're meant to help treatment. They're meant to add it to treatment. They're meant to provide basic ideas, but they're not meant to define treatment. They're not meant to drive treatment, and they're certainly not meant to manualize treatment as a stepwise process that's going to be the same in every particular case. So be aware, these are not treatment manuals, and that's true for all workbooks that are out there. They're workbooks. They help treatment. The Stages of Accomplishment workbooks, as we've said, are interrelated workbooks going 1 through 4. They are intended to be written for, be used by adolescent boys, low average to above average intelligence, primary language is English, who of course have engaged in sexually abusive behavior or sexually troubled, sexually inappropriate behavior. That's who it's designed for. For the most case, these kids are going to be in residential care, but in many cases they're going to be in outpatient community treatment as well. The most comprehensive use and probably the greatest value of any workbook is probably in conjunction with residential treatment or group care treatment, because treatment in those environments is much more comprehensive, of course, than can be possibly achieved in an outpatient program where a client comes in perhaps for 1 hour a week of individual session or 1 group a week. They certainly can be used there and are designed to be used in an outpatient setting, but they're really going to have the greatest facility and use for kids who are in group care, congregate care kinds of settings, because that treatment is much more comprehensive, and all workbooks are intended to be comprehensive, and that's certainly true for the Stages workbooks. Each workbook is built on a sequence. Again, not only can you jump around, but I encourage you to jump around to make the workbooks fit, but nevertheless, the workbooks were designed in a particular sequence. They move from basic material that's not particularly intensive, that's more educational, to material that ultimately becomes more sophisticated, more complex, more detailed. Each workbook builds on the prior workbook. and each workbook is intended to set the foundation for the following workbook. Although, again, I want to be clear, you can use these workbooks out of sequence. They can't each be used as standalone elements of treatment, which again means that you need to know the material ahead of time so that you're familiar with each workbook. And you can use them out of order. You can go from workbook 2 to workbook 1, or you can start with workbook 4. Again, they're intended to be used in a sequence, but that's only in the most general way. They were built that way, but at the same time, you've got to be able to customize them. Different populations. Now, I said these were really designed for adolescent males, average IQ, primary language English. The problem with that is, of course, we've got sexually abusive females, young women, girls. We've got pre-adolescent kids. We've got kids who are cognitively lower functioning or intellectually disabled. The workbooks really were not designed for that population because each of those populations, if you will, differs from that average adolescent boy that I described. And each of those populations differ from one another. But if you are going to use them with a population outside of which it was designed for, you have to make sure that you're making adjustments so that the workbook fits that particular population. Lots of these exercises are quite relevant for females as well as males, although you may have to make changes in some cases. But again, want to really be clear that they were aimed and designed for a particular population. That population I've just described, adolescent males, average IQ, that is the primary population that we're going to be dealing with when we look at who's coming into treatment. But of course, we have females, we have lower functioning kids, we have younger kids. Once you are familiar with the workbooks, you won't need much guidance in the use. You'll be able to adapt them to fit your particular, not simply client, but your approach to treatment. That clinician's guide that I've mentioned several times is going to help you to think about, become acquainted with the workbooks as a whole, also the workbooks, these workbooks in general, and also how do you use workbooks as part of a larger approach to treatment. The stages workbooks, when you think about applying them in a treatment setting, they were meant to help kids learn new information. They were meant to help them to think about, to work through, to address elements in treatment, including, as I've said several times, a way to reflect on their own lives, to become more self-aware. We've got those written exercises, we've got those thinking points. These things are intended to provide a means for self-discovery and the acquisition of new ideas as well as practicing skills. They vary in content, they vary in approach. Different exercises in different books are intended for different purposes, but also intended for use at different points in the treatment process. So, quickly going to go through an overview. Each of the interlinear workbooks builds upon the previous one. Previous workbooks provide a foundation. The workbooks move from thinner, workbook 1 is quite thin, to workbook 4, which is quite chunky. So the length, the depth, the complexity, as well as the length of particular exercises. The workbooks are meant to be user-friendly. Again, average IQ, they're meant to be nevertheless understood quite simply. So they were written to be understood in plain language that speaks directly to each kid. Each workbook looks very much the same, even though they get thicker and it covers different material. Each begins with the same introduction. Obviously, you don't need to repeat the introduction every time a kid moves from one workbook to another, but certainly the introduction is important and should be discussed with clients at least once, and perhaps more often, as necessary as you bring additional workbooks into use. It goes from elementary material to more complex material. It becomes richer, deeper, more sophisticated. So stage 1 workbook, it's smaller, it's easier to understand, it's easier to complete, and it's less overwhelming than using the stage 4 workbook. Jumping into the stage 4 workbook could be complicated for a kid who hasn't been in treatment. And as I said, it's longer, it's thicker, it's got more chapters. And that means that kids are less likely to be put off by thicker workbooks if they start with workbook 1, which contains simpler material. It's much more direct and easier to complete, and kids are less likely to feel intimidated or overwhelmed by the work if you're handing them a workbook this thick. As those workbooks increase in size, they increase in their complexity, the depth of their content, and they allow for a level of gradated success as kids move from one workbook to the next. Again, the idea of stages of accomplishment, making sure that they are mastering material in small chunks that provide the basis for tackling more complex material later. Each workbook looking at a different aspect of treatment, starting with orienting clients to treatment. And each workbook provides exercises that are relevant to the development of treatment at that particular level. General construction, very similar, same elements of design in each workbook. We've got the text, which is really largely informational, in which I hope is talking directly to our clients. And again, several common teaching elements. We've got the clinician's guide that will give you a detailed description of every workbook and the contents of every workbook. So a very quick look at stage one, an introduction to treatment. Kids are going to learn about treatment. They're going to learn a little bit about themselves. They're going to learn a little bit about why they're in treatment. There's just 3 chapters in that workbook: introduction, participating in treatment, understanding sexually abusive behavior. Workbook 2, it's a little thicker, understanding yourself. Kids are now focusing more on themselves, their feelings, their thoughts, their attitudes, and how these different kind of responses they have to the world come together to contribute to their sexually troubled behavior. So here we have 5 chapters, and we start to see some of the areas that are fairly common to treatment. Thinking errors, chapter 5. Chapter 4, attitudes, beliefs, and values. Chapter 3, understanding and managing feelings. Chapter 2, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And chapter 1, learning about yourself. So moving from basic learning about self to getting into some of the meat that's quite typical to sexual offender, sexually abusive youth treatment programs, cognitive distortions. Workbook 3 moves into cycles, understanding dysfunctional behavior, understanding the problematic cycles and problematic behaviors that kids engage in, and sometimes their impact on others. Dysfunctional behavioral cycles, phases of the dysfunctional behavioral cycle, high-risk situations, behavior management, staying safe, preventing relapse. And workbook 4, the thickest, hitting the target. Here we're looking to build permanent change. We're helping kids here to be able to connect to other people, to feel like they're part of a community, and in some cases to make amends. Here you can see 6 chapters: empathy and caring, victim awareness, victim clarification, community service, communication, healthy relationships. And that's a good example of a chapter that might be very relevant to a kid much earlier in treatment. That may be a chapter you want to go to at some earlier point. And then, of course, chapter 6, which is the final chapter. Beyond differences, the construction is very much the same in terms of the way that the chapters are built. Content is different. Key concepts. Throughout each chapter, we're going to come back to remind kids at periodic points, these are the things we're learning. These are the ideas that are key to this chapter. Written exercises, which are these assignments. What have you learned? Review questions and learning exercises. And if you choose to use it that way, a staff review. The best approach to understanding and assigning those workbooks is, again, to become familiar with each workbook, the workbook series as a whole, and the exercises within them. You may choose to assign particular exercises. It's likely that you're going to really assign whole chapters rather than just simply an exercise, or perhaps sections of chapters. Again, you can move around, but only if you know the material yourself. Different types of exercises. Some clinicians might pick certain exercises independently of a chapter, or even independently of the text. But the exercises, although they are designed to be used in a sequence, if you use them as standalone exercises, it's really not recommended unless you really first use the exercise as it's designed, meaning it's part of a chapter, or at least that section within the particular chapter. So we encourage you to use standalone, if you will, exercises only when they've really been previously completed and you're reassigning them. You may reassign them for any number of reasons. You want to go back and revisit, or perhaps it wasn't very well done the first or second time around. At a later point in treatment, it may well be worth coming back and revisiting and completing that exercise again, perhaps from a more sophisticated perspective. It keeps the workbooks alive when you revisit exercises. It helps to both test for and build comprehension and retention. It makes sure the workbook isn't just a static thing that just disappears into the past as the treatment journey completes. There's a series of in the clinician's guide, a series of appendixes. Here's what they look like briefly. Alternative to the dysfunctional behavioral cycle that's in there. It's a one safe step at a time model that was designed for younger kids or kids who have greater intellectual challenges. Similarly, a simplified version of the dysfunctional behavioral cycle. Those key concepts that I described, they're all in that single appendix so that you can get them in one particular spot, and a list of all the thinking errors. Appendix E, 3 stages of thinking errors, so we go beyond simple models of thinking errors, 3 stages of cognitive distortions. healthy and unhealthy relationships in Appendix 4, and there's a series of tests if you choose to use them. So the appendix includes 4 tests, 1 for each book. They're not mandatory by any means. It's simply another option for the clinicians. They give questions to be completed, a series of definitions to be completed, by each client, and they're entirely optional. They're entirely up to you to decide whether you want to use them. And of course, in the appendix, in the clinician's guide, you get the answers. That's just a simple look at what it looks like. I don't know how well you can see it there, but it's just a simple example. That's just 1 page of the stage 1 test. Wrapping up, last couple of slides, it doesn't matter how good the workbook is. If clients are not motivated, workbooks are going to lack any real utility. They're just going to be something that's done. So an early element of treatment means building motivation in the client, fostering that sense of motivation, building a collaboration. Unless the client is motivated internally, it's unlikely that any workbook is going to provide them that level of motivation to make sure that treatment actually has some meaning. So motivation, in every case, is going to be key to any kind of gains in treatment. And that usually needs to be developed outside of the workbook itself through the relationship, that collaborative partnership with the clinician. We're not going to talk about how to build a treatment relationship. And I've already described some of the pertinent elements in those 13 points of how to make sure that you're using the exercises correctly. But nevertheless, when the clinicians recognize those elements, when they build them into their work with individual elements, that relationship, that partnership is likely to really support and make effective all treatment, including the use of those workbooks. We don't want to minimize the work that accomplished by completing those kids, by those kids and completing those workbooks. I'm aware of the time here. But we want to reiterate again, completing the workbook doesn't equal success in treatment. It's an aspect of treatment. All workbook, including the work stages, is going to be tied into, used, and understood as part of the broader treatment process. So, last slide, stay in touch. Definitely feel free to reach out to me for any clarification. I have an easy email address. You really just have to remember my name. I have a site out there. You can just look me up by name. I'm not Phil Rich the Apostle, but I'm the other Phil Rich. You will see Phil Rich the Apostle coming up. There's my email. All you need to do is remember my name. That's it. So let me hand it back over for any questions or comments. Joan, I can't hear you. Joan,
Yeah, let's try this again. Okay, gotcha. Let's try this again. Thank you so much, and really appreciate all that you shared with us today. We had a couple of questions as well coming in. So I think probably the key question that came in really was, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what's unique about this series, and also just like how it might compare to to other workbooks. I think a couple of people have asked about Pathways in particular.
Okay, so Pathways certainly has been around a long time, and I think it's probably in at least its 4th edition, and has become more sophisticated over time and more holistic. In designing the Stages workbooks, they were not, although of course there's going to be overlapping sorts of ideas, they weren't really intended to compete with Pathways. In fact, the program that I used these in when they were first developed, we used these and we used the Pathways workbooks, although eventually we tended to use these more because, of course, it reflected the model of the program. So a lot of the ideas are going to be similar, but they're going to perhaps fit your particular understanding. So I'll use an example of the behavioral cycle. The Stages workbooks do use a behavioral cycle, and so does the Pathways workbook, but they're different looking cycles. The cycle in the Stages workbook was intended to be much more individualized than the cycle in the Pathways workbook, for instance. And so one of the differences is that the goal here is to really help to individualize treatment more, so it really more easily fits in each individual youth, and not assume, to use that example, that the behavioral cycle is always going to look exactly the same way for every kid. It isn't. It's going to be very, very different. So there's just an example of where things look different. The thinking errors model here breaks thinking errors down into 3 different types of thinking errors. Not just simply a single list of thinking errors, but different types of thinking errors, some of which are self-destructive, some of which are destructive to other people. And in addition, the workbook really focuses on the idea that thinking errors operate differently at different points. Some thinking errors are in effect before a kid engages in sexually troubled behavior. Some thinking errors are in effect while they're engaging in the behaviors, and some thinking errors follow the behaviors. So there are differences like that. The particular approach is that when you take those 4 workbooks and you add them all up, it covers a lot of material, but it does it in a way that hopefully really fits the behavioral level for each, the treatment level, the personal level and characteristics for each kid in a way that's not overwhelming, but nevertheless covers a lot of material, including relationships, as well as very basic information and material. Beyond that, it's very hard to, it's almost like asking, to compare, how can I say, 2 different kind of apples. They look different, they taste different, they're both the same kind of fruit. I think to some degree it depends upon what works best for you in terms of what your thinking treatment should look like, what ideas resonate the most with you. So I'm not sure if I've really answered the question, but hopefully that I've given a general answer. And for whoever asked that question, there's my email. I'm not sure it's still up on the screen, but phil@philrich.net. Feel free to email me. We can continue to, we can talk more about that if you're looking for more information.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Yeah, I think, and obviously, I think that partly what you're saying too is that each clinician needs to become familiar with the workbooks and see what feels most comfortable with their own treatment approaches. So, one other question that came in here also was that I know you've talked about how this can be adapted, but could you just talk a little more specifically, particularly how it might be adapted to use with girls or younger children?
Yeah. Okay. So. Well, actually, let me give a really, really good example. Some of the written exercises prevent little stories, and the stories are most typically oriented towards a male engaging in a particular behavior, sometimes towards another male, sometimes towards a female. When you're using that storyline in a particular written exercise with a female, whether it's a young woman or a younger girl, we're not asking them to get into the mind of what it's like to be a boy. So there's a perfect example of where we may want to ask you as the clinician to take that story and perhaps just adapt it. I'm sorry there's no way to really do it for you, but to really ask you to retype it, but just switch the roles. Have that be a female. That's the protagonist, if you will, in the story, the written exercise. So there are going to be exercises that are clearly designed for males. The basic content, I think, will be exactly the same, though. That is to say, trying to understand how you might, as a client, behave in this particular situation, or getting into the particular thinking of that particular client. At the same time, there are other exercises, using that as a good example, of where it may be perfectly relevant for that young woman to be thinking about how that male might have been thinking, and then perhaps add a little bit to that to ask, how might you behave in a situation like that? So there would be an example of trying to adapt it. At other times, thinking errors are a perfect example. Those thinking errors are perfectly relevant to females as they are to males. Antisocial behavior, though, in a female may look a little bit different than antisocial behavior. Classically, and certainly we live in a changing world, but classically, sociologically, antisocial behavior in males tends to be more physical, and antisocial behavior in females tends to be more social, although that's shifted and changed. So there's examples, again, of perhaps having to switch up and shift the material. To work with girls. Some of the material I think fits perfectly well. Some of it needs to be adapted. Some of it just doesn't fit at all for girls, although there's not much of that. Most of it can be adapted. For younger kids, it's a little different because with younger kids, some of the language may really need to be not dummied down. Younger kids are bright too, but explained or even rewritten or just described instead of being read out loud. Same would be for lower cognitive functioning kids. We may need to find simpler ways. I've mentioned in the clinician workbook there are a couple of alternatives to the behavioral cycle that are really exactly the same as the behavioral cycle. They're just presented in a completely different way that really were aimed at latency age kids, that is to say pre-adolescent kids or adolescents who are cognitively lower functioning. So there is some of that material in there. The clinician's guide kind of points to some of those things and I hopefully helps people to think about how can you adapt some of this material. But again, I just want to reiterate, it's probably not possible to write a set of workbooks that fits every particular client. And if I had more time, I would have written a female version of this and a pre-adolescent version of this and a version for cognitively low functioning kids as well. So again, hope I've at least touched on how to use the material and how to adapt the material for different populations outside of the population it was written for.
That's great, yeah. And also just, I don't know if you can see this, but that also Neary Press has Growing Beyond, which is a series of workbooks for girls by Sue Robinson. So that's also another alternative for people who are interested particularly in the question of working with girls. So I want to just mention that one as an alternative as well.
Yeah, and can I just say, Sue's done a nice job in there of really, again, a holistic model. She talks not just about sexually troubled behavior, but about becoming an adolescent female, becoming a young woman. And again, it's a holistic kind of a model, but that's a perfect example. And it may or may not fit with this model. It may be something that you'd want to use the stages with and Sue's workbook, or simply use Sue's. But it's a very different workbook than the series. Right. It's a perfect example of, I think, a model that's aimed at not simply sexually troubled behavior in girls, but developing females as a whole. Sorry, John, didn't mean to.
So I have one more answer if you can give a quick answer, or one more question if you have a quick answer. Just that one person asked about the research that you have used that either support the outcomes of using these workbooks or just in terms of the supporting actually development of these workbooks. So if you could talk a little bit about whether you have research on either end of that.
You know what, I've never seen any research that's talked about. There's a small body of research that talks about the value of therapeutic workbooks in general, but not really for this population. You know, the stuff you find at Barnes and Nobles, for instance. You know, you go and look for workbooks where these things really. There's a small body of research that talks about client responses, but that's more typically aimed at people who are really interested in self-help, and that's why they're using workbooks and not necessarily assigned to them. But there's not a lot of research in general about what role do workbooks play in effective treatment outcomes. I've actually never seen, I tend to read all the research in our field. I've never seen anything that really has looked at.
Yeah.
So the result is, it's like a lot of what we do in treatment. It's things that seem to make good sense to us. It's a way, we do think that psychoeducation and cognitive behavioral treatment is an important aspect, and there's certainly research that supports that. Workbooks like this sort of fit that model in that much of what they present really is part of cognitive behavioral treatment, but there's nothing really that supports the use of workbooks as particularly effective. And at the other end of that, all of the material that's built into the research at the development end is really kind of based upon the common ideas and thinking in our field, some of which is supported by research, but nothing that you could sort of say, this particular body of research, it's built upon the research that's out in the field in general. What are the things that we think are important to cover in treatment? So again, that perhaps wasn't as quick an answer as you wanted, but hopefully, and it wasn't as long an answer, hopefully though, it at least gave an answer. And again, anybody's free to get in touch with me if you want to talk further about this.
That's great. Thank you. I just want to remind people, we're just about almost out of time, but I want to remind people that we are offering a 20% discount on Phil's books. If you use this code SEPT27, September 27, which is today's date, that's valid until October 17th. Lastly, I just want to also just remind people that if you did sign up, that we will be sending you information about CE credits offered through GIFR, and that just to remind you that this is only for people attending the live webinar, so there will be a form, and you must complete that form within the next 7 days. So I just want to remind you of that. Also to say that since you signed up for this, if you have not already been a part of our Neary Press newsletter, which translates one article each month into something that's short enough to read over a cup of coffee. It's sort of taking some of the cutting edge materials. We also will be signing you up for that newsletter. If you're not interested, just let us know. You can unsubscribe at the bottom of the newsletter. And I want to remind people that if you want to be guaranteed a seat at the table, especially for some of our sold out webinars, you can become a sponsor at $98 for individuals or $250 for organizations, and you're guaranteed a seat at every webinar table. You have access to our CE credits. You get 2 new Neary Press books. If you want to sign up, you can either sign up on our Neary Press webinar, or you can, it's our website, or you can contact Diane Langelier at this number, 413-540-0712, extension 14, for more information or to sign up in person. Last, I just want to say thank you for our existing sponsors, which are the Counseling and Psychotherapy Center, Jarena and Associates, Gippsland Center Against Sexual Assault, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, Morrison Child and Family Services, New Hope Treatment Centers, and Parkside Psychological Associates ER Counseling. So I want to thank you for our existing sponsors. We could not be doing this without you. And also just thank you, Phil, so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I always find your webinars incredibly helpful and informative. And just want to say we're looking forward to your online or offline training, your in-person training, however you call that. There's one slot available to people who want to sign up. So thank you very much, Phil. It's great having you here today.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. And I hope to see you another Neary Press webinar in the future. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.